Welcome to the channel Mirelle Tales. Before we start, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, let's get into today's story.
That morning, I signed my divorce papers. That afternoon, my ex-husband took his mistress to buy a Rolls-Royce. He told her, "It's only $1 million. If you like it, we'll take it." The salesman said, "I'm sorry, sir. All 3 of your cards have been declined." The Los Angeles County Courthouse was unusually cold this morning. It wasn't the aggressive chill of overzealous air conditioning, but the profound coldness in the way people look at each other when they come here to sign a piece of paper that ends a life they built together. I sat with my back straight on a gray plastic chair, a cheap blue ballpoint pen in my hand. Its tip rested lightly on the final page of the divorce agreement. On the table, the documents were stacked so neatly, as if everything could just be folded up, tucked into a drawer, and pretended it never existed. But I knew some scratches aren't on paper. They're carved into your heart. Across from me was Richard, the man I'd been married to for 5 years. He sat with his legs crossed, leaning back, one hand idly flicking a silver Zippo lighter, the other holding an unlit cigarette. His eyes on me weren't filled with hatred, nor with sorrow. It was the look of a man who believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was winning. The look of someone standing on high, watching a woman about to fall from the pedestal he called my wife. He smirked, his voice slow but loud enough for the others waiting nearby to hear. "Once you sign that, Eleanor, you're no longer Mrs. Hayes. Don't think for a second that this divorce means you're free. There's no one to pay the mortgage, the utilities, no one to support you like a child. You're 30 years old. What are you even going to do? Run home to your mother's?" I didn't look up. I just flipped to the page that needed my signature, pulled the agreement toward me, and placed the pen exactly where my name was supposed to go. My hand didn't tremble. I had done all my trembling during the long, sleepless nights alone, listening for the sound of his car returning late, smelling the foreign perfume clinging to his collar, and hearing the lies that were so smooth you could only believe them or turn yourself into a paranoid wreck. I had chosen a third option: silence, observation, and documentation. Richard looked at me like I was a piece of outdated furniture. He let out a short, dry laugh. "Silent treatment, huh? Don't pretend to be strong. You've gotten used to living off me." I signed my name. The script was neat, clean, not a single stroke out of place. As I set the pen down, I felt a door slam shut inside my chest. Not the door to love that had died long ago, but the door to my own silent endurance. I pushed the agreement across the table to Richard. The paper rustled. It was a small sound, but to me, it was the snap of a tether breaking. Richard grabbed a pen and signed his name with the swiftness of someone acknowledging a delivery. He tossed the pen on the table and stood up, adjusting the lapels of his tailored black suit. The kind of suit I used to iron perfectly every Monday morning so he could walk out of our home looking like a king. He glanced toward the door, where a young woman was leaning against the wall, arms crossed. Her makeup was as flawless as a magazine cover. A tight-fitting slip dress and stiletto heels made her stand half a head taller than me. And the designer handbag she carried was one I had stared at through a shop window for a long time before deciding it was an unnecessary extravagance. She saw me looking and smiled, a smile as thin as a razor's edge. "Are you done, Richie? I have a car appointment, and this is wasting my time." Richard walked over and put his arm around her, his voice disgustingly affectionate. "What's the hurry? We just finished." He turned back to look at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "Eleanor, just so you know, I'm taking Amber to pick up her new car this afternoon, a Rolls-Royce. About $1 million. Maybe a little more. I bet you'll never even touch a steering wheel like that in your entire life." I finally lifted my head and looked directly into his eyes. Not to beg, not to question. I just looked at him like he was a stranger telling a hollow story. "I wish you and Amber a lifetime of happiness," I said slowly, clearly. My voice was so calm, it surprised even me. Amber pouted, tilting her head mockingly. "Oh, listen to her, so noble. But you can drop the act, honey. I can see the bitterness all over you." Richard laughed, pulling her toward the exit. Before stepping out, he threw one last comment over his shoulder, like a clump of mud. And don't come crawling back to me when you're broke. From now on, we are completely done." I stood up, folded my copy of the divorce agreement, and placed it in my purse. In an inner pocket, my phone screen was lit up. On it was a long spreadsheet: numbers, columns, itemized expenses, every wire transfer, every stock sale, every strange withdrawal that had vanished from our joint accounts. I had spent countless nights cross-referencing, saving receipts, taking screenshots, requesting bank statements, collecting every piece of evidence like shards of broken glass. For 5 years, people thought I just knew how to cook and clean. But some women, the more they are underestimated, the more they learn to survive in the silence. I walked out of the room, down the long corridor leading to the main entrance. The bright Los Angeles sun fell on the pale tiled floor. I took a deep breath, feeling like for the first time in years, I was breathing with my own lungs, not with the weight of my forbearance. Behind me, the sound of Amber's heels clicked on the floor, accompanied by her triumphant laugh. "Oh, Richie, I want the white Phantom. It's gorgeous. Let's get it today. I want to drive it to dinner tonight." Richard's voice was firm, resolute. "If you like it, you get it. $1 million is just a number to me." I paused for a beat but didn't turn around. I wouldn't let them see my face, not out of fear, but because I refused to waste another expression on them. I just reached into my purse, my fingers brushing against my phone as if touching a promise. I opened my contacts and found the name I had saved long ago, Mr. Davies, Esquire. My thumb typed a short, precise message. It's signed. Proceed as planned. Just seconds later, the screen vibrated. Received. Everything is ready. Let them walk into it. I turned off the screen and dropped the phone back into my bag. Outside, the city traffic hummed on as usual. Life kept moving to its own rhythm. I stood under a jacaranda tree in front of the courthouse, watching the people pass by, and felt a strange calm settle over me. Not the quiet of sadness, but the quiet of a decision made and executed. Richard thought I was leaving this marriage with nothing. He thought I was weak, scared, that I would collapse. He had no idea. I had been preparing for this day since I found the lipstick stain on his passenger seat and the hotel receipt hastily stuffed under the floor mat. Every time he lied, I wrote it down. Every time money disappeared from our joint account, I traced it. Every time he took something that belonged to our family to lavish on another woman, I stayed silent. I needed him to be overconfident. I hailed a taxi and got in. "Where to, ma'am?" the driver asked, looking at me in the rearview mirror. I gave him the address as calmly as if I were going to a regular appointment. The Rolls-Royce dealership in Beverly Hills. The driver paused for a second, then gave a slight, awkward laugh. "That's where the big money is. Going car shopping?" I looked out the window, at the sun racing across the pavement. Inside me, a small fire had just ignited. Not hot and angry, but steady and enduring, like glowing embers. "Yes," I said. "I'm going to watch a play." The taxi pulled up in front of the Rolls-Royce dealership on Wilshire Boulevard just as the clock struck 3. The building was a towering monument of glass and steel, gleaming under the California sun, reflecting the sky like a giant diamond set amongst the palm trees. I stepped out of the car, adjusted the strap of my purse, and took a deep breath. The scent of high-end leather and the cool rush of conditioned air hit me the moment the automatic glass doors slid open, carrying with them a feeling of deliberate, unattainable luxury. It was a feeling that once made me think it belonged to another world, a world not meant for a woman who, until recently, spent her years worrying about grocery lists and dinner plans. Inside, the showroom was serenely opulent. The polished marble floors reflected the soft light from crystal chandeliers. Enormous, silent cars were parked like rare, sleeping beasts. I walked slowly, deliberately keeping a low profile. My eyes scanned the vehicles, but my focus was on the space itself, the location of the payment counter, the entrances and exits, and the discreet security cameras mounted on the ceiling. I wasn't here to buy a car. I was here to witness a demolition. A young salesman in a sharp suit approached me, his smile professionally calibrated. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Is there a particular model you're interested in?" I offered a slight, polite smile back. "I'm just browsing for now. I might come back later with some questions." He nodded. gracefully stepping back to give me space. I stopped beside a silver ghost, pulled out my phone, and pretended to take a few pictures. The screen reflected my face, unnervingly calm. In my mind, every detail of the plan replayed with perfect clarity. I knew Richard would come here. He couldn't resist. With his need for ostentatious displays, he would choose the most public, most expensive stage to affirm his new life. And I knew he would bring Amber. She was the audience he wanted to impress the most. I didn't have to wait long. Less than 10 minutes later, the sharp, rapid-fire click of stiletto heels echoed from the main entrance, followed by the familiar voice I had heard for 5 years, in all its shades from tender to cruel. "See, Amber? I told you. This dealership has the most beautiful Phantom in all of LA." Richard strode in, Amber on his arm. He wore a navy blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a perfectly knotted tie. Amber was in a form-fitting white dress, her hair in perfect waves, her face a mask of meticulous makeup. She moved as if she were walking a red carpet, her eyes sweeping across the showroom with unconcealed pride. I shifted my position slightly, using the body of the car to shield myself, just enough so they wouldn't spot me immediately. I wanted to see them at their peak, in their moment of absolute confidence. A salesman immediately rushed forward, his posture deferential. "Welcome, sir, ma'am. Here to see the Phantom, I presume?" Richard nodded, his voice dripping with self-assurance. "That's right. My wife fancies the white one. Do you still have it?" The word wife was emphasized, a deliberate jab at the ink that was barely dry on our divorce papers. Amber giggled, leaning into him. "Oh, Richie, you're making me blush." Her eyes darted around and then they landed on me. For a split second, surprise flickered across her face, quickly replaced by a look of pure contempt. She tugged on Richard's arm, whispering just loud enough for me to hear, "Look who's here. I guess she came to see what she can never have." Richard turned his head. When he saw me, he froze for a beat before a wide, condescending grin spread across his face. "Eleanor, fancy seeing you here." I stepped out from behind the car, facing them directly. I wanted to see the cars, too. Amber sneered, her eyes raking over my simple blouse and slacks. "You like Rolls Royces? That's cute. But these are a little out of your price range, don't you think?" I didn't answer her. Instead, I looked at the salesman and asked a simple, calm question. "What kind of engine does this ghost have?" Before the young man could reply, Richard cut in, his voice oozing superiority. "She's just window shopping. Why don't you help us first? We're taking the Phantom today." He turned to Amber, his tone softening into a lavish doting. "If you like it, we'll buy it. It's only $1 million. The salesman quickly led them to the white Phantom parked in the center of the showroom. Amber gasped dramatically, running her hand along the car's flank in a deliberately showy gesture. "It's perfect. I love it." Richard nodded, pulling out a thick leather wallet. He extracted a black, high-limit credit card and placed it in the salesman's hand as if it were a casual business card. "Run it. We'll pay in full." The atmosphere in the showroom seemed to slow down. A few other customers turned their heads. $1 million isn't a sum you hear being spent on a casual Tuesday afternoon. Amber stood beside him, chin held high, her eyes sparkling with smug satisfaction. I stood a few feet away, leaning lightly against another car, my phone in my hand. My heart beat steadily. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't anxious. I knew exactly what was about to happen. I was just waiting for the curtain to rise. The salesman took the card to the payment counter. Richard crossed his arms, the picture of nonchalant wealth. Amber turned to me, a smirk playing on her lips. "You see, Eleanor, some things in life you can't get just by wanting them." I looked her straight in the eye. "You're right. Some things look solid, but they're hollow on the inside." Her brow furrowed, not quite understanding, when a sharp, dry beep came from the counter. The salesman stared at the screen of the card machine, then typed in the numbers again. His eyebrows drew together slightly. Richard frowned. "What's taking so long?" The salesman looked up, a hint of confusion in his professional smile. "Sir, I'm sorry, but the transaction was declined." The air in the showroom went still. Amber whipped her head around to face Richard. "Declined? What does that mean?" Richard forced a laugh, waving his hand dismissively. It's probably just their machine. Run it again. The salesman did as he was told. The screen flashed the same red text. I stood there, feeling like I was watching a slow-motion film. I knew this was only the opening scene. Richard pulled out another card, a platinum one this time, and tossed it onto the counter. Use this one. The salesman was more careful now, his movements deliberate. Once again, the transaction was rejected. Amber was losing her composure, her voice rising in pitch. Richie, what is going on? Richard didn't answer. He took out his third card, the exclusive, invitation-only Amex Black card, and swiped it himself. The showroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. The salesman hit enter. The screen lit up with the same familiar words. Sir, the salesman said, his voice now laced with genuine unease, this card isn't working either. Amber stood frozen. Richard was stunned into silence for a moment, then his face flushed a deep, angry red. What? That's impossible. How could all three of them be declined? I watched as the layers of his manufactured confidence began to crumble, piece by piece. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, a silent witness to the moment I had been preparing for months. This wasn't the end. This was just the first door slamming shut. The silence in the showroom was now so thick it felt like a physical weight. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled, the marble floors still gleamed, and the billion-dollar cars sat in their proud, silent rows. The only things that had changed in the last 5 minutes were the faces of Richard and Amber, their expressions shifting second by second, the change so stark it was impossible to hide. I stood a few feet away, my phone held loosely in my hand, my heart as steady as a placid lake after the mud has settled. Richard marched toward the payment counter, snatching one of the black cards from the salesman's hand. He turned it over and over, as if inspecting it for a flaw, as if he could will it to work through sheer disbelief. This is impossible. I used this card just yesterday. The salesman bowed his head slightly, maintaining his professional composure, but with visible strain. Sir, I'm very sorry, but the system is showing the card has been canceled. It cannot be used for any transaction. Amber, standing beside him, gripped her designer purse so tightly her knuckles turned white, the red polish of her nails digging into the expensive leather. Cancelled? Who would dare cancel Richard's cards? The question hung in the air, unanswered. I knew the answer, and a cold dread was beginning to dawn on Richard's face, even if he couldn't yet accept it. Around us, the other patrons had stopped their browsing entirely. Their curious glances were like tiny, sharp needles, pricking away at the ego of a man accustomed to being admired. Richard turned back to the salesman, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Check them again. All 3 cards have a combined limit of over $2 million. How could they be canceled? The salesman swallowed hard and reran the check on his terminal. A moment later, he looked up, his voice even lower. I'm sorry, sir. All 3 cards show the same status. They were canceled at the request of the primary account holder. In that instant, I saw Richard flinch as if he'd been struck. His face went pale, a sickly white that drained all the color from his skin. Amber spun around to face him, her eyes wide with a mixture of panic and accusation. The primary account holder? Richard, did you cancel your own cards? He shook his head, his voice strained and unfamiliar. No, I didn't. I took one step forward, not to draw attention, but to position myself directly under the light, where they could see me clearly. Richard's gaze snapped to me, his eyes locking onto mine like a man who had just found the terrifying answer to a riddle he didn't want to solve. Eleanor, he breathed. Was this you? I looked directly at him. I didn't smile, nor did I deny it. I simply asked a very quiet question. Do you have any proof? That question was like an invisible slap across his face. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Amber, however, had lost all restraint. Her voice shot up, shrill and piercing. Don't you play innocent? Who else could it be? The whispers started to spread through the showroom. All 3 of his black cards were canceled. Wow, and just a minute ago he was saying $1 million is just a number. Talk about a fall from grace. Each word landed like a cold stone on the marble floor. Richard clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. He turned back to the counter, his voice now almost pleading. Is there another way? A wire transfer? Anything? The salesman shook his head. I'm sorry, sir. The bank accounts linked to these cards have also been frozen. At present, you are unable to make a payment of this size through any method here. Amber let out a dry, choked laugh that she quickly stifled. She glanced around, realizing just how many people were staring at her. The arrogant smile from minutes ago was gone, replaced by a raw, unconcealable embarrassment. Richie, she whispered, maybe we should just go. Richard didn't answer. He stood there like a statue with a crack running through it, his eyes fixed on the white phantom one last time with a look of bitter longing. The showroom manager finally emerged, his expression polite but firm. Sir, ma'am, if you are unable to complete the transaction today, I must ask you to please come back another time, so as not to disturb our other clients. That sentence was the final nail in the coffin. Amber dropped her head, grabbed Richard's arm, and pulled. Let's go, Richie. He turned, his back no longer straight and proud, and walked toward the exit. I stood and watched them go. As soon as they were out of sight, I received a text from Mr. Davies. Phase 1 complete. Prepare for Phase 2. I left the dealership a few minutes after them. The afternoon sun had softened, and a light breeze rustled the palm trees. I wasn't euphoric. I wasn't triumphant. The moment of their public humiliation had been enough to close the chapter on Richard's final act of arrogance. The rest didn't require an audience, only the law. The taxi dropped me in front of a skyscraper in downtown LA, home to Mr. Davies's law firm. I went straight up to the 50th floor, where cool white light illuminated the hallway. Mr. Davies was waiting for me in a glass-walled conference room, a thick stack of binders laid out neatly before him. He nodded as I entered. How did it go at the dealership? I sat down, placing my purse on the polished table. Exactly as we predicted. He smiled, not with glee, but with the quiet confidence of a man whose plan was unfolding perfectly. Those cards were all issued during the marriage. The initial funds all came from joint accounts. Legally, you had every right to request their cancellation upon discovering clear evidence of asset dissipation. He won't take this lying down, I said. Of course not, Mr. Davies replied, pushing a document toward me. Which brings us to Phase 2. This is the emergency motion to freeze his assets. The house in his mother's name, the car registered to a friend, the offshore accounts. We don't need to be loud. We just need to be precise. I took the file and flipped through the pages. Each line of text felt like another layer of skin being peeled back, revealing the true face of the man I had once called my husband. What do you think his reaction will be? I asked. Mr. Davies paused for a moment. Panic. Then anger. Then he'll try to shift the blame. But eventually, when he finds every escape route blocked, he'll be forced to face reality. I signed my name. The pen stroke was firm, steady. I was no longer the woman afraid of losing her family. That family had been lost long ago. Today, I was just officially acknowledging it. Leaving the law office, my phone rang before I even reached the elevator. Richard's name flashed on the screen. I stared at it for a second, then answered, Eleanor, what the hell do you think you're doing? His voice was no longer arrogant, no longer sharp. It was raw and edged with something that sounded like fear. I'm taking back what's mine, I said calmly. Don't push it, Eleanor. You're the one who pushed, Richard. There was a tense silence on the other end. I could hear his ragged breathing. Those cards, that was you, wasn't it? I acted within my legal rights. Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're backing me into a corner. I watched the endless stream of cars below. You backed me into a corner a long time ago. I hung up. Not out of anger, but because there was simply nothing left to say. That evening, another text came from Mr. Davies. Motions filed. The court will review them tomorrow morning. High probability of approval. I put my phone down and leaned back on the sofa in my empty apartment. This home had once been filled with laughter, then slowly, only a heavy, oppressive silence. I used to think divorce was the end. Now I understood. It was just the beginning of getting justice. The next morning, as I was making coffee, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Richard was standing there. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie was crooked, and his face was etched with exhaustion. Can I come in and talk? I blocked the doorway. Say what you need to say right here. He swallowed hard. I know I was wrong. But freezing all my assets like this, my company can't operate. I can't make payroll. Those assets don't belong only to you, Richard. I'll give you your share back. Just stop this. I don't believe in promises anymore. He clenched his hands. Are you trying to destroy me? I looked him straight in the eye. I just want you to be held accountable. He stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked away. His shoulders were slumped, all the swagger of a successful man completely gone. It was less than a week later that the real fallout began. Richard's business partners started putting projects on hold. The banks began reviewing his loans. His company was drowning in a financial audit. I didn't have to do anything else. The system simply began to correct itself once the truth was brought to light. One afternoon, I ran into Amber in the courthouse hallway while filing additional paperwork. She wore no heavy makeup, no designer clothes. "Are you happy now?" she asked, her voice hollow. I looked at her, feeling neither anger nor pity. "You should be asking yourself why you're here." She gave a bitter laugh. He told me everything was fine. I believed him. Believing in someone else's money is always a risk. She lowered her head and walked away in silence. That evening, I received the court's preliminary order. The asset freeze was upheld, pending a full hearing. I read the document over and over, not with joy, but with relief. It felt like I was finally standing on solid ground after years of walking on thin ice. I knew the real storm was still ahead. The trial would be where everything was laid bare, where Richard could no longer hide behind his money or his words. But I wasn't afraid. I had already survived the longest nights. After the first court hearing, I thought I might finally have a moment to breathe. But I was wrong. The gears of consequence, once they start turning, gather their own momentum, and no one can easily stop them. What happened next unfolded not in the quiet halls of a courthouse, but out in the open, on the unforgiving battlefield of the business world where Richard had once reigned as a titan. Just 2 days after the judge upheld the asset freeze, my phone began to ring. And ring. They weren't calls from Richard, but from a series of unfamiliar numbers. I didn't answer. I knew that when business partners smell risk, they seek confirmation from every possible source. In this storm, my silence was my strongest shield. Mr. Davies called me for coffee at a quiet cafe near his office. I arrived early, chose a corner booth, and ordered a black iced coffee. When he arrived, his expression was calm, but his eyes were sharp with focus. "It's started," he said, sitting down. I figured as much. One of Richard's major investors just sent a formal notice. They're invoking a risk clause to pause a multi-million-dollar development project, citing legal exposure from the asset dispute. I stirred my coffee, the ice cubes clinking softly against the glass. "Just one?" Mr. Davies shook his head. "3, as of this morning, and there will be more. In business, people can tolerate a partner who is ruthless, ambitious, even a little shady. What they cannot tolerate is a partner who is a walking liability, a man whose assets are frozen and who is facing protracted public litigation. You can always make more money. You can't always rebuild your reputation." That afternoon, I received a text from an old acquaintance, a woman whose husband had once done business with Richard. "Eleanor, I heard there's trouble with Richard's company. Are you okay?" I read the message and put my phone down. I didn't need pity, and I didn't need to explain myself. The truth was finding its own way into the light. A couple of days later, a detour for a traffic jam took me past the gleaming office tower where Richard's company was headquartered. It wasn't intentional, but I found myself looking up at the familiar windows. From the street, I could see employees coming and going with tense, worried faces. Small groups huddled outside, speaking in hushed tones. The atmosphere of crisis was so palpable you could feel it from the sidewalk. That night, Richard called again. This time, I answered. "Eleanor," he said, his voice ragged with exhaustion, stripped of all its former pride. "Can you tell your lawyer to slow down? Just for a little while?" "Slow down what, Richard?" "My partners are backing out. The banks are calling me nonstop. The company can't take this. You should be talking to your lawyer, not me. You know better than anyone." he pleaded, his voice cracking. "If this continues, I'll lose everything." I looked out my window at the city lights twinkling below. "Did you think about that when you were wiring our money to someone else?" Richard was silent for a long, heavy moment. "I was just trying to maintain an image." "An image can't keep a company afloat," I said, and hung up. The next day, Mr. Davies sent me a summary. A strategic partner had officially terminated their contract. A major bank had tightened Richard's credit line to near zero. A flagship project was now postponed indefinitely. The crucial links in the chain that held his empire together were snapping, one by one, and the whole machine was starting to shake violently. I didn't feel a thrill of victory. What I felt was a strange, hollow sadness, a sadness for the man who had everything but threw it all away for his own ego and greed. Then came the anonymous tip. A carefully curated package of documents, leaked by Mr. Davies's team to a key investor, revealed something even I had only suspected. Richard was running a shell corporation. It was a separate legal entity, registered under an old friend's name, used to funnel money from certain contracts and to hide a mountain of debt from the main company's balance sheet. The news triggered a full-scale investor audit and, more terrifyingly for Richard, caught the attention of the IRS. His house of cards was collapsing. One afternoon, I ran into Amber again. It was a chance encounter at a small cafe. She was sitting alone, huddled over a cup of coffee, looking small and lost. She wore a simple dress, her hair was tied back, and her face was pale and bare. When she saw me, she flinched. "I guess you won," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This isn't a game. His company is about to go under." I looked at her and saw not a rival, but a young woman who was just as lost as I had once been. "You should start looking out for yourself." Her voice trembled. "Isn't this enough for you? He's lost everything." "I'm only taking back what was always mine," I replied. Amber looked down, and a tear splashed onto the table. I didn't stay. Pity couldn't help either of us now. By the end of the week, the final blow came. Mr. Davies called me. "They've done it," he said. A group of his minority shareholders, spooked by the audit and the asset freeze, have invoked their rights. They've called for an emergency board meeting. "What for?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They're voting to remove him. To oust him as CEO." I closed my eyes. I remembered the early days, staying up late with him while he drafted business plans, encouraging him through every setback. I once believed his success was our success. But he had never seen my contribution as anything more than background noise. The empire Richard had built on my silence was about to be dismantled by his own investors, and the stage was now set for the final act in court. The day of the final hearing arrived under a heavy, gray Los Angeles sky. It wasn't raining, but the air was thick with a damp, oppressive weight. I arrived at the courthouse early. Each slow, deliberate step I took up the worn marble stairs felt like I was treading on the silent, wasted years of my marriage. I hadn't dressed to impress. I wore a simple white blouse and dark trousers. I didn't need to make a statement. The truth, documented in neat, chronological binders, would speak for me. Mr. Davies was waiting in the lobby. He gave me a reassuring nod. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be," I said. My heart wasn't racing with fear anymore. It was beating with a focused, steady rhythm. I knew today would be filled with uncomfortable words and accusing stares. I also knew that once I walked through those courtroom doors, there was no turning back. The courtroom smelled of old wood and paper. The rows of benches were already filling up. On the opposite side of the room, Richard was sitting with his lawyer. He looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him, almost frail. Dark circles hung under his eyes, and his expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame. When our eyes met, he looked away instantly. The judge entered, and everyone rose. As the gavel struck the wood, I had a sudden, sharp realization. This was no longer just my story, or Richard's. This was a place where every word spoken had a consequence, where lies withered under the sterile light of the law. The judge began, his voice even and devoid of emotion. "This court is now in session to review the plaintiff's petition regarding the division of marital assets and to rule on the matter of fraudulent conveyance." Mr. Davies stood up. He presented our case with surgical precision. One by one, bank statements flashed on the screen, a clear, undeniable trail of money moving from our joint accounts into hidden ones. Deeds to properties purchased in the names of Richard's mother and cousin, all funded with marital money. Documents for the offshore accounts and the Shell Corporation, where millions had been funneled without my knowledge or consent. These transactions, Mr. Davies stated, his voice ringing with authority, were not business expenses. They were a systematic and deliberate effort to defraud my client of her legal share of the marital estate. Richard's lawyer rose to object. My client asserts these were personal expenditures and investments, not an attempt to hide assets. The judge turned his gaze to Richard. Mr. Hayes, do you have a response? Richard stood, placing his hands on the table in front of him. I admit I moved money, he said, his voice faltering slightly on the last word. But it was money I earned. I had the right to use it as I saw fit. Mr. Davies immediately presented another document. Permission to approach, Your Honor. This exhibit proves the initial capital for Mr. Hayes's company and the funds for its subsequent growth were derived from joint marital assets, including Miss Hayes's own salary and savings during the early years of their marriage. I saw the numbers on the screen, my own income, the inheritance I'd contributed, small streams of my life's work that had been swallowed by the great river of his ambition. I had never thought I'd need to keep a record of it, but when trust is betrayed, you learn to become your own archivist. The judge nodded, making a note. Mr. Hayes, any comment on this evidence? Richard said nothing. He just stared down at the table. The air in the courtroom grew heavy. I could feel the eyes of the people in the gallery on me, some curious, some pitying, some judging. I ignored them all. My focus was on the proceedings, on each question and each answer. When it was my turn to speak, I rose to my feet. I didn't ask for a penny more than what the law entitled me to. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, I only ask that the assets we built together during our marriage be divided fairly. I do not consent to our shared resources being used to finance a secret life. The judge looked at me, his expression unreadable. Do you have proof of this secret life? Mr. Davies stepped forward again. Hotel receipts, airline tickets for two, a series of damning text messages. I didn't look at the screen this time. I had already stared at them for too many sleepless nights. Richard's lawyer jumped up. Objection! This is a gross invasion of my client's privacy. The judge brought the gavel down. This is a civil matter concerning the disposition of assets. This evidence speaks directly to the motive for the fraudulent transfer of those assets. The court will allow it. Overruled. Richard sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I watched the last shred of his arrogant facade crumble and fall away. There are no convincing arguments when the numbers and the paper trail are aligned against you. The court recessed for the judge to deliberate. As the room filled with murmurs, I sat perfectly still, my hands clasped in my lap. I wasn't praying. I was just reminding myself to breathe. Mr. Davies leaned over. It looks good. I'm confident the judge will uphold the freeze and rule in our favor. All I needed was for the truth to be validated. A few minutes later, the judge returned. The room fell silent. The court finds that there is substantial and compelling evidence of fraudulent conveyance of marital assets by the defendant, Mr. Hayes, he announced. Therefore, the court orders that the existing freeze on all disputed assets will remain in effect. A final judgment on the division of said assets will be issued, ensuring the plaintiff receives her equitable share, including the recovery of all unlawfully transferred funds. The gavel came down with a final, echoing crack. I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of joy, but because a great weight had finally been lifted. As the courtroom emptied, Richard hurried into the hallway. I gathered my things, ready to leave, but he suddenly appeared in front of me, blocking my path. Eleanor, he said, his voice low and urgent, did you really have to take it this far? I looked him straight in the eye. You're the one who took it this far, Richard. I was wrong, he said, the words rushing out as if he were afraid I wouldn't listen. Give me a chance to make it right. I gave you so many chances, I replied. You ignored every single one. He stood frozen for a moment, then took a step back. The arrogance in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, hollow helplessness. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. I took a deep, clean breath. I knew this verdict wasn't the end of the story, but it was a crucial turning point. From now on, everything would be brought into the light. There were no more shadows for him to hide in. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Davies. "Prepare for the final asset recovery phase. We will see this through to the very end." I turned off the screen and walked down the steps. This time, my stride felt lighter. The day I received the final judgment, I was sitting in my small home office. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm, peaceful glow on my desk. My phone vibrated. It was Mr. Davies. I answered, and his voice came through, clear and definitive. "It's official, Eleanor. The judgment is signed and filed." I was silent for a moment, letting the words sink in. And the outcome? Exactly as we argued for. The court has ordered the complete reversal of all fraudulent transfers. The asset freeze will remain in place until every last dollar is accounted for and returned to the marital estate for division. His other financial misconduct has been referred to the appropriate authorities for further investigation. I closed my eyes, not with emotion, but with a profound sense of release. An invisible burden I had carried for months, for years, had finally been set down. "Thank you, Mr. Davies," I said. "Don't thank me," he replied. "This was your right. You just had the courage to claim it." When the call ended, I sat in the quiet for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. Instead, a deep calm settled over me, like the surface of a lake after a violent storm has passed. I realized that some victories don't bring elation. They simply bring a necessary and final closure. That afternoon, a single text message appeared on my phone from Richard. It was just 3 words: "You won. I'm ruined." I looked at the message, then deleted it without replying. Not out of spite, but because I knew there was nothing left to say. Winning and losing, right and wrong, those arguments were over, settled by the unfeeling logic of the law. The consequences were now his alone to bear. In the weeks that followed, the final pieces of his collapsed empire fell into place. I heard his company had officially filed for bankruptcy. Employees were let go, creditors lined up. The high-interest loans he had taken out in a desperate attempt to stay afloat were now coming due, and there was nothing left to pay them with. The man who once moved through Los Angeles's most exclusive circles was now facing the stark, unglamorous reality of total financial ruin. I didn't seek out this information. The story was over for me. One evening, while clearing out a closet, I found an old journal from the first years of our marriage. The pages were filled with my youthful, hopeful handwriting, detailing dreams and plans we had made. I read a few entries, a strange mix of pity and wry amusement washing over me. The woman who wrote those words had truly believed that if she just tried hard enough, loved deeply enough, everything would turn out right. I closed the journal. I didn't throw it away. I kept it as a reminder not of what I had lost, but of how far I had come. A week after the judgment, Amber contacted me. She asked to meet at a small, unassuming coffee shop. When I arrived, she was already there, looking frail and exhausted. Her eyes were puffy, her confidence completely gone. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice small. "What is it?" "The court has ordered me to return everything he gave me," she said, looking down at her hands. "The car, the jewelry. I don't know what to do." I looked at her, no longer seeing the smug mistress from the showroom, but a young woman caught in the wreckage of her own poor choices. "That's a legal matter," I said gently. "You need a lawyer." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I really thought if I could just attach myself to a successful man, my life would be set. "There are no shortcuts," I replied. The meeting was brief. It wasn't about forgiveness or blame. It was just a quiet, final acknowledgement of the collateral damage. On the drive home, I thought about how a single lie can shatter so many lives, fueled by the illusion that money and status can protect you from consequence. That night, I sat at my computer and began to write. Not a journal, but my story. I wrote not to complain or to boast about my victory. I wrote to remind myself, and perhaps someone else out there, that anyone can find themselves in my position if they place their trust in the wrong hands and forget their own worth. I understood then that the law could help me recover my assets, but only I could help myself recover my life. I started making plans for the future. A real future, not one contingent on someone else's mood or approval. I focused on my career, took on a leadership role in a new project, and reconnected with friends I had drifted away from. For the first time, I felt like the architect of my own life. There were still nights when I would think of Richard, not with anger, but with a distant, detached sorrow. I had loved him once. That was a fact. But the man he became was a stranger to me, and I no longer needed to know him. The complete and utter rupture of our life together, as painful as it was, turned out to be the very thing I needed to be reborn. Without it, I might still be living in that hollow marriage, deceiving myself with the empty title of wife. I learned that freedom isn't a destination you arrive at, it's a path you choose to walk every day, and my journey was just beginning. The days following the final judgment weren't filled with the cinematic sparkle of a new beginning. There were no triumphant montages, no celebratory toasts with friends clinking champagne glasses. Life after the storm was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The end of a marriage, especially one that ends in a legal firestorm, isn't just the loss of a husband. It's the dismantling of a routine, the erasure of a rhythm that has dictated your life for years. In the beginning, I'd wake up early out of habit, my body still wired to a schedule that no longer existed. There was no one to make breakfast for, no one's mood to gauge for the day. I'd make my coffee, open the blinds, and watch the city come to life, just as I had before. But now, I wasn't watching it from the sidelines. I understood that every morning I woke up was for me, not in service of a role I was no longer playing. I started reclaiming my space, both physically and mentally. The task of clearing out Richard's belongings was less emotional than I expected. I folded his expensive suits, packed his shoes, and placed them in boxes for charity. It felt less like erasing a memory and more like archiving a part of my history that was now officially over. Someone asked me why I didn't just sell the apartment and move. "I'm not running from the past anymore," I told them. "This is the place where I hurt, and this is the place where I healed. I'm staying to remind myself that I survived the darkest days right here." I threw myself back into my career with a focus I hadn't had in years. Before, my job had always felt secondary, a side project to my primary role as Mrs. Hayes. Now, it became my anchor. I took on challenging projects, spoke up in meetings, and started networking again. I learned new skills I'd put off because Richard had deemed them unnecessary. Some nights, I'd come home exhausted, the kind of deep, satisfying tired that comes from building something of your own, not from being drained by someone else's drama. One afternoon, I had a final meeting with Mr. Davies to sign the last of the paperwork. As I finished, he looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "You seem to be handling this better than I imagined." "I don't have a choice but to be okay," I replied. "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "You're okay because you've finally accepted the truth." His words stuck with me. Accepting the truth. It sounded so simple, but it was the hardest thing in the world to do. For years, I had lived in a state of willful denial, telling myself things would get better, that his behavior was just a phase. Many people would rather live in a familiar, comfortable pain than face a truth that demands they change their entire lives. I had been one of them. I started spending more time with my family. I drove up the coast to visit my mother, cooked with her, and listened to her stories. She never once asked about Richard or the divorce. She didn't need to. One day, as I was washing dishes, she came and stood beside me. "You've lost weight," she said softly. "I'm fine, Mom." "I know," she said, "but you don't always have to pretend to be so strong." I turned away, surprised by the sudden sting in my eyes. Some words don't need to be profound to hit the most vulnerable part of you. I also had to learn how to be alone again. The silence of the apartment was deafening at first. No television blaring sports, no tense arguments, no anxious waiting. I started filling the quiet with things I loved: books, music, sometimes just my own thoughts. The solitude, once a source of dread, slowly transformed into a peaceful sanctuary. It was the space I needed to hear my own voice again, a voice I had silenced for far too long. An old friend asked me over dinner one night, if you could go back, would you still have married him? I thought about it for a long moment. Yes, I said. She looked at me, stunned. After everything he did? Yes, I repeated, because without that marriage, without that pain, I wouldn't be the person I am today. I no longer saw the past as a mistake. It was a lesson, an expensive, painful lesson, but one I had finally learned. I started observing the women around me more closely and saw my old self in so many of them. The silent compromises, the forced smiles, the quiet desperation of trying to hold together something that was already broken. I never offered advice. I had no right. But I hoped that they, too, would one day find the courage to ask themselves the questions I had been too afraid to ask. There were still moments when I would dream of Richard. In my dreams, he wasn't the monster he had become, but the charming, ambitious man I had fallen in love with. I'd wake up with a pang of sadness, not for the man he was, but for the man I thought he could have been. The feeling would pass. It was just a ghost, an echo of a life that was no longer mine. My future was an unwritten page. I didn't know who I would meet or where I would be in 5 or 10 years. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. I had been at the bottom, and I had learned how to climb back up on my own. I wrote these final thoughts not to celebrate my strength, but to acknowledge that rebirth is not a single event. It's a process. It's the sum of 1,000 small choices you make every day to be a little truer to yourself, a little kinder to your own heart. And my story wasn't over. It had just found a new and much better beginning.
Aa, siktir git. Şansa bak. Şaka yapıyorsun. Siktir git. Şaka mısın? Oğlum imkansız bir şey. İmkansız. LoL'de olması %1 olan bir şey oldu. Ya siktir git. Adam çalıya trap atmış, onun üstüne flash attım biliyor musun? Aman aman. Geliyorum. Ya. Öldüm. Ya şu an gerçekten anlamıyorum bu oyunu. Sikim anlamıyorum şu an bu oyundan. Çok salak salak oyun oynuyorum. Allah. Garip oyun onunla koyayım. 4 asist oldu. Neyse.